Ric Flair, To Be the Man, Chapter 3, Mr. Charisma. There's a picture of Ric Flair holding his arms out in a robe. Angelo King Kong Mosca once predicted, "Rick, if you live past 30, you'll be overstaying your welcome." And I was doing my best to make his words come true. Ray Stevens and Harley Race were both great wrestlers whose performance between the ropes was never affected by their lifestyles. Stevens had been wrestling since he was a teenager in the 50s. He was known as the Blonde Bomber and was a genuine legend. Race and I would end up trading the NWA title back and forth. The first time I ever met Harley, he could tell I was a huge fan. We were in Grand Island, Nebraska, and had to go over the Rocky Mountains, about 400 miles into Denver. We had to go over the Rocky Mountains, about 400 miles into Denver. He and Stevens were in the station wagon, and they had bet Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell that they could beat them into the hotel. Harley asked me, "Do you want to ride with us, kid?" Of course, I jumped at the chance. At first, I was really enjoying myself. Harley was driving as fast as he could, and Stevens was screaming, "I'm a fucker and a fighter and a wild bull rider with a pretty fair windmill hand." But as soon as we got into the mountains, the snow really started to come down. The two of them pulled out 2 quarts of Southern Comfort and began passing it around. Every time the bottle came to me in the back seat, they'd turn on the interior light and check the rearview mirror to make sure I was drinking. Being a station wagon, the car wasn't going that fast up the mountain. But when we went downhill, Harley made up the time. He was really gunning it, probably going about 100 miles an hour down these snowy, winding roads. Harley Race is talking here. It says, "I look in the rearview mirror and noticed that Flair's slapping Stevens out the shoulder, pointing out the speedometer. Eventually, Stevens looks over at me and says, 'You're going to kill us.' I tell him, 'Have another drink. We're going to win this thing.' Stevens says, 'If you don't slow down, I'm going to knock you out.' I answer back, 'If you're so worried about getting killed, that'd be a good way of assuring it.' Now Flair starts to heave out the back window, and the snow's coming down so heavy that the back of his head is one big snowball. We pull him back into the car, keep going, and beat Gagne and Brunzell to the hotel by about 45 minutes. I know that Rick enjoyed himself because he's told this story himself about 1,000,000 times. Now, I don't think Harley Race talks like that, but there's these fucking anecdotes by other wrestlers get confusing, so I'm going to talk in a weird voice. Larry Hennig loved to pull jokes on me in the ring. Larry was a man among men who'd put fans in front face locks and squeeze until they were unconscious. If they dared imply that wrestling was fake. His son, Kurt Hennig, used the name Mr. Perfect in the World Wrestling Foundation and would also become one of my good friends. In a match, Larry would hit me real hard and say, "Don't sell it." So I'd act like I didn't feel the blow. He'd turn to the referee and sneer, "Look at this young punk. He thinks he's too good to sell for me." Then he'd hit me really hard again and say, "You better sell this one." I'd go down on the floor, but he'd complain to the ref, "What's the matter with this kid? He's selling too much." I was terrified that I was doing the wrong thing. He'd keep beating the shit out of me while I'd be asking the referee, "What did he say?" And this would go on for 10 minutes until the match was over. When I'd get backstage, though, I got the impression that the older, wilder guys saw something in me that the other rookies lacked. Hennig once told me, "You already have all the fucking around done. Now all you have to do is learn how to wrestle." Then Wahoo came to the AWA and my life changed forever. When Ed Wahoo McDaniel played for the New York Jets in 1964, the public address announcer would declare, "Tackle by guess who?" And all the fans in the Shea Stadium would chant, "Wahoo! Wahoo!" He even had his nickname, not his last name, on the back of his jersey. Wahoo was part Choctaw and part Chickasaw and wore an Indian headdress into the ring. Even when he wasn't around, people were telling Wahoo stories. One of my favorite was about the time he ran 36 miles in 6 hours for a $100 bet with Bill Watts. I liked Wahoo. Damn, dude. He ran 36 miles in 6 hours for $100. I liked Wahoo instantly, the same way I liked Dusty. He was a man's man. He hunted and fished and partied and could wrestle. With the exception of Mad Dog Bacon, he was the only wrestler I knew who'd get sewn up without Novocaine. He was also a phenomenal athlete and played golf with people like Charlie Pride and Mickey Mantle. I remember hearing a story about Wahoo losing $5,000 to Lee Trevino. Why would he be playing golf with Lee Trevino, a tournament pro? Because he was so competitive. Wahoo was the man, brother. He rocked. Here's a picture real quick. And it's a picture of Wahoo McDaniels in his Indian red headdress. And it says, Ed Wahoo McDaniels, the single greatest influence on my wrestling career. He didn't take shit from wives either. He was married 5 times. If a woman didn't like his lifestyle, he'd tell her not to let the door hit her in the ass on the way out. He was bad to the bone. In Atlanta, it was common knowledge that the wrestlers hung out at a place called D. Ford's on Stewart Avenue. Crazy fans would come in there and hassle the boys. Tommy Rich, who was NWA champion for a week in 1981, occasionally got drunk and egged them on. One night, about 3 guys had Tommy down in the parking lot and were beating the hell out of him. Wahoo saw it and got his gun while Dick Slater, another wrestler, started coming from the other direction. Wahoo got to where Tommy was and hit one of the guys in the head with the pistol. It went off and shot Slater in the leg. Wahoo and I started to become close. He invited me along one day on a trip to Fargo, North Dakota. Red Bastion, one of my childhood favorites, who impressed me even more when I knew him as a peer, went along too. The plan was to fight a Fargo in wrestler Lars Anderson's plane. I didn't know Lars is a pilot, I said, to which Wahoo responded, well, he can fly, but he doesn't have a license. Holy fuck, these dudes are fucking stupid as shit. We got into a single engine 182 and Lars followed the highway from Minneapolis to Fargo in the daylight. I didn't think anything about it. On the way home, though, it was dark and snowing and Lars had smoked a joint before he left. If that didn't disorient him enough, he, Wahoo Bastion, and I began drinking Boone's Farm apple wine on the plane. Lars was trying to find the highway but lost it in the blizzard. We ended up landing on a football field instead of at the airport, but I was relieved to be on the ground. I'll always associate Wahoo with the birth of my oldest daughter, Megan. We were in Minneapolis at a bar called The Left Guard with Greg Gagne. Someone had asked if I wanted to go to a party, and for some reason I didn't feel like it. I went home around 1:30 in the morning, and at about 2, Leslie went into labor. There were no cell phones back then. If I hadn't decided to call it a night, I would have been with Wahoo when my daughter was born. Clearly, I had a long way to go before I got my priorities straight. I was pretty much willing to do anything that Wahoo asked. At one stage, he insisted that I buy 2 pairs of well-crafted wrestling boots from a guy named Clifford Messias in Houston, who a lot of main eventers used. The problem was, even though I wanted to look like a star, I wasn't getting paid like one. I ended up spending $400, $200 a pair, when I was making about $120 a week. Still, I'll never have any regrets about taking Wahoo's advice. While we were in the AWA, he told me about the wrestling promotion in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was heading there when his stint with Gagne was over. His friend George Scott had just started in Charlotte as a booker, the man who makes the decisions on storylines and talent, and Wahoo promised to drop my name. Keep working hard up here, he urged, and I'll call you from Charlotte. True to his word, Wahoo phoned me a few weeks later. They want to book you, he said. I think you should come down. I left for Charlotte in 1974. I've been there ever since. Okay, here's an anecdote by Mean Gene Okerlund. I'd known Rick since he was a bouncer at George's in the park. I later announced his first televised match in Minneapolis against Kenny Kenny J, who had the moniker the Sodbuster because he used to lay sod in front of Vern Gagne's palatial estate out on Lake Minnetonka. Ric's charisma, that square jaw, his demeanor in the ring, that body language, told you that he was going to be the best. And he was pretty assertive. While some of these other guys were just enamored with being seen on television, Ric Flair appreciated his own self-worth. If Vern wasn't going to take Ric where he needed to go, Ric was going to get out from under Vern and go elsewhere. Vern understood that I needed to keep learning the business. Back then, guys would travel from one wrestling territory to another, picking up the different styles. Charlotte seemed like the illogical next step. Just before I left, I went to see Vern and thank him for everything he'd done for me. By the way, I asked, could I borrow $400? I'm broke. No, I can't do that for you, he said. You have to learn to handle things on your own. I shook Vern's hand and started to leave. Oh, one more thing, he said, slipping a document across his desk. It was a contract guaranteeing that Vern would see 10% of my earnings for the next 5 years. Believe it or not, I wasn't offended by the gesture. Vern was the one who had taught me how to be a professional wrestler. I was ready to sign the document right there, but Vern said, take it with you, have a look at it, and send it back. When I got down to Charlotte, I asked the promoter, Jim Crockett Jr., if this was a standard practice in the wrestling business. We don't give out contracts like that, he replied, sounding a little shocked as he read through the document. Nobody owns 5 years of your life. Crockett recommended that I tear up the contract and send it back to Vern, but I couldn't do that. He had put in time and effort to train me. He certainly earned something. Eventually, Vern called to see if I'd signed the contract. I told him how I'd felt. I don't think it's right, I explained, but I was willing to pay him a still substantial flat fee of $2,500, Crockett's advice as well. Send him a check for what you think he deserves. That seemed to be okay with Vern. We remained friendly, and even when I was touring the world as the NWA champion, I occasionally returned to the AWA to make special appearances on his shows. I don't think the Iron Sheik signed his contract either, though Patera told me that the 10% was taken from his paycheck when he left. I headed to Charlotte with a new look. Before leaving Minneapolis, Billy Graham's wife Bunny had bleached my hair blonde, just like the superstar. Dusty, Murdoch, and Ray Stevens. I got a pair of tie-dye trunks and started wearing a headband like Graham as well. I didn't have his physique, but I knew, if given the chance, I had the gift of gab. Here's an anecdote by Wayne Coleman, a.k.a. Superstar Billy Graham. It was time for Ric to make the transition, so we got it done. He ripped me off, but not as bad as Jesse Ventura. That's all right, though. It's a great compliment when they take your stuff. I landed in Charlotte and was picked up at the airport by Johnny Heedman, an old-timer whose days in the ring were pretty much over. He still wrestled on occasion, but most of the time he worked in the office for the promotion. Johnny brought me over to the Orvin Court Hotel. The fee was $8 a night, checked me in, then drove me to the Charlotte Coliseum where I wrestled another aging veteran, Abe Jacobs, and got the win. Leslie was still in Minneapolis with Megan, with only about $200 to my name. I couldn't afford to bring them with me. I don't think my parents were completely sold on the idea of me leaving my family behind to advance my career below the Mason-Dixon line. Deep down inside, though, I knew I was making the right move. Okay. The Charlotte wrestling territory was started in 1935 by Jim Rocket Sr., or Big Jim, a businessman who also ran restaurants, promoted concerts, and Harlem Globetrotters games, and owned the Baltimore Orioles AA affiliate as well as their stadium, Crockett Park. Like most wrestling companies at the time, this was a regional operation, affiliated with the gigantic National Wrestling Alliance. Every year, the various NWA promoters held a convention where they debated over whether to keep or change their world champion. Whoever had the title would then tour, defending his title in one territory after another. The Crockett family's territory, also known as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, was based in Charlotte but extended through the Carolinas and into Virginia. Even when the NWA champion wasn't around, fans still filled arenas in Greensboro, Spartanburg, Roanoke, and other cities where the territory's own United States and Mid-Atlantic titles were defended. It was different than the AWA, where you could count on the occasional night off. In Charlotte, we worked every single weeknight, twice on Saturday and twice on Sunday. When I arrived, the Crockett's were in the middle of a power struggle. Big Jim's son, Jim Crockett Jr., was a quiet guy who hadn't really planned on going into the wrestling business. When Big Jim died in 1973, his wife Elizabeth decided that her son-in-law, John Ringley, would run things. Then Ringley got caught having an affair with a beauty queen, and the Crockett kids, Jim Jr., David, Jackie, and Ringley's wife, Frances, voted him out. Jim Jr. was only 24, but everyone thought he'd be the best replacement. That is, except Ringley, who didn't want to leave. This is a anecdote by David Crockett. My brother Jenny was not that outgoing. My brother-in-law Johnny was a good salesman and had the ear of a lot of the talent. You have to remember, too, that Johnny started working for my dad a lot earlier than anybody else in the family. But he was having an affair with this woman out in Memphis and just was not thinking straight. This was a family business, and he was throwing it in the family's face, plus disrespecting my father with what he was doing. We could only have one person dealing with the talent, with the Harlem Globetrotters, with the concert promoters, and with the bank. This had to be a dictatorship. It couldn't be Jimmy and Johnny, so Johnny had to go. This presented a challenge for Jimmy, since the other NWA promoters looked at him as just Big Jim's kid. There was a definite vacuum, and he had to prove himself to everybody. To the powers that be in the NWA, Big Jim was held in high esteem, but I couldn't see that Jimmy was struggling for respect. But I could see that Jimmy was struggling for respect and was ready to work hard to get it. He and I were from the same generation. We thought alike and became friends quickly. I had come to Charlotte to grow as a wrestler, and Jimmy was there with me, transforming into a smart promoter and successful businessman. He listened to his booker, George Scott, and let him bring in wrestlers who could take the company to the next level. Of course, you had to pay if you wanted a certain quality of talent. It all went hand in hand, and Jimmy paid. This is another anecdote from David Crockett. Having George Scott there was a necessity. Some bookers began to think that they're more powerful than the promoter. They bring in wrestlers who are their friends and stop being innovative. George was nothing like that. He was creative, and he knew how to get the most out of the talent. And maybe even more importantly, he was no longer wrestling. So instead of consuming all the talent in order to build himself up as a star, he concentrated on the other wrestlers' strengths. Okay, there's a picture. It's Ric Flair he has Wahoo, and it looks like some type of hammerlock or weird armbar. And it says, "Wrestling Wahoo gave me the skill and confidence I needed to handle myself in the ring." I felt I had two people always looking out for me, Wahoo and George Scott. In the ring, Wahoo taught me the ropes, while George channeled all the wisdom he'd acquired during his years as a wrestler into booking. He took a territory that was known largely for its tag teams and started creating individual stars. After the Orvin Court, I switched hotels to the Coliseum Motor Inn, where the fee was something like $36 a week, and began running up a tab at Valentino's restaurant, paying when my check arrived at the end of each week. I didn't have a car yet, so the promotion arranged for me to ride to the different arenas with Johnny Valentine, a major drawing card who was one of the first components in George's plan to make the Mid-Atlantic singles division stand out. Bleached blonde, tanned and fit, Valentine had been handling shows all over the world for about 20 years, literally beating on opponents with a forearm to the chest. In Charlotte, the move was called the Brain Buster. When he worked for the WWE WWE owner Vince McMahon's father, Vincent James McMahon, or Vince Sr., in the Northeastern-based Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWF, announcer Ray Morgan labeled Valentine's finisher the Atomic Skull Crusher. Valentine definitely had a star presence. I'd been reading about him in wrestling magazines since elementary school, but he was an odd guy. Early in his career, George Herbert Walker Bush was campaigning for office in Texas and was introduced at a wrestling show in Houston. He came into the ring, but when he turned his back on Valentine, Johnny gave the future president of the United States the finger. In Charlotte, Johnny generally kept it to himself, reading or playing chess without saying too much. To a kid like me, he was completely aloof. He also wouldn't pick me up anywhere, so I had to hitchhike to a mutually agreed upon spot. The first time we drove together, he put on a tape of bad Italian opera and blasted it. For the entire trip to Greenville, South Carolina, he didn't look at me or say a word. One side of the tape would finish, and he would just turn it over and play more opera. It was the same on the way back. When we returned to the spot, long past midnight, he would drop me off without a word. It was too late to hitchhike, so I had to walk 2 miles, or so through a bad neighborhood with bleached blonde hair and a ring jacket slung over my shoulder. In the ring, Valentine wanted everything to look legit. If he was asked to execute a move off the ropes, he either refused it or did it grudgingly. He felt that those types of things cheapened the business, since you would never run backward and bounce off a bunch of cables in a real fight. He'd take a body slam once in a while, but never a high back body drop. Johnny's way was to get a guy in a simple hold, like a hammerlock, cinch up on it, let go, beat the shit out of his opponent, then clamp on the hold again. This could go on for 10, even 20 minutes, but you know, the crowd got into it. They really believed that he was hurting the guy with that hold. I learned a lot watching Valentine. The way that he made everything he did seem meaningful. Whenever somebody hit him hard and repeatedly, he'd fall forward, right on his face. In time, I ended up doing the same thing. Added a stumbling walk before I took the dive. After a few car rides together, Valentine began talking to me. But you always had to be careful whenever he was around. He was a terrible practical joker, playing very insensitive pranks. Jay the Alaskan York was asthmatic, and Valentine once put lighter fluid into the guy's inhaler. Jay came back to the locker room, winded after his match, grabbed the inhaler, and threw up all over the floor. If I thought riding with Valentine was strange, it was nothing compared to driving around with the Missouri Mauler and Brute Bernard. I hadn't spent a lot of time in the South, but these two quickly gave me an education. They'd have their country music blaring, drinking beer, while Brute would be eating his clove of garlic and raw onion. Here's another picture. It's a picture of Ric Flair with Johnny Valentine, and they both have belts on. And the caption says, "My first singles belt, the Mid-Atlantic Television Championship, looked good on me, though I wanted Johnny Valentine's Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title." And this is still Rick whenever he's got the tie-dye and he's ripping off of Billy Superstar Graham. "Hey kid, you like country music?" one of them asked. I kind of nodded. "Where are you from, Flair?" "Minneapolis." "Minneapolis? What do they think about niggers up in Minneapolis?" Pardon me? I've become a pretty jaded guy, but these two really shocked me. I considered Minneapolis a tolerant city, and even on his worst day I had never heard my father speak like that. "Well, down here, we hang fucking niggers from trees." They were even worse whenever they were with their manager, Homer Odell, who always carried 2 pearl-handled revolvers with him. Once at a baseball park show in Richmond, Virginia, a group of fans attacked Professor Boris Malenko, whose son Dean would end up in the Four Horsemen with me in the WCW. The Big O, Bob Orton Sr., grandfather of WWE superstar Randy Orton. They stabbed Malenko, cutting him from the neck all the way down to his groin, and hit Orton with a baseball bat. Odell came running into the crowd, shooting off his guns, and the mob scattered. I have no doubt that Malenko and Orton owed him their lives. In the car, Bernard and the Mauler would fire each other up, talking about niggers and coons and spooks, their words, and what they'd like to do to the whole race. Holy shit, people. One day we were driving across a bridge and saw a bunch of black guys fishing off the side. Bernard and Mauler pulled over, jumped out of the car, and flipped one of the poor guys into the water. Thankfully no one was hurt, but the experience kind of made me pine for Valentine's opera music. My first check in Charlotte came out to $1,000, a fortune in my eyes. I then approached Jimmy Crockett with a request. You know, I'd really like to have my wife and daughter down here, but I don't have the money yet. Jimmy lent me $3,000 and advanced me some more cash to move my family to Charlotte. I made all the arrangements for Leslie and Megan to join me, and once they were settled in, took the money that was left over and bought my first caddy, a used black Fleetwood from Art of Arnold Palmer Cadillac. Arnold Palmer. That's the way my wrestling career went for the next 15 years. If I made $3,000, I spent $4,000. If I made $5,000, I spent $10,000. The image people would later have of Ric Flair throwing around money was absolutely true. The difference was, in the real world, there wasn't always more where that came from. There wasn't always more where that came from. In Charlotte, I finally took the K off of the end of my first name, changing Rick to the catchier Rick. I told audiences that I had blonde hair that Elk Summer likes to run her fingers through, a body that looks like it was carved out of granite by Michelangelo, and that Raquel Welch would give her right arm to run suntan lotion on. George Scott decided to team me up with Rip Hawk, a sharp-dressing older guy who was a fairly good speaker. He and Rawbone Swede Hansen were a well-established tag team, but they'd recently broken up and were now feuding. Swede had taken on a young African-American named Tiger Conway Jr. as a replacement. As Hawk's partner, I was expected to counter Conway's fan popularity with useful arrogance. "You got Mr. Charisma, Mr. Excitement, Ric Flair!" I trumpeted on television prior to clashing with Conway. "I'm going to leave you with an Excedrin headache, baby, bleeding, messy, crying, begging for your mammy." George figured that Hawk could mold me as a wrestler while I'd help him stay contemporary. I found him to be an intelligent guy who had a lot to offer someone with my relative inexperience. But when we went out at night, he wasn't as loud or boisterous as Wahoo or Ray Stevens. In fact, sometimes I felt that he looked at me with a bit of astonishment. "He'd be all right," he once said about me. I was feeling more confident every time I stepped into the ring, and I was learning against a whole variety of opponents. One night I'd be in there with Wahoo, the next night with Andre. For the first time in my life, I'd found a forum where both my athletic ability and my personal eccentricities were held in high regard. I knew that George and Jimmy had gotten word from guys they respected, tough, hard ring vets like Stevens, Larry Henning, and Red Bastion, that I was dependable, and the fact that I could put up with their jokes only enhanced my position. Here's another picture. It says, "Good old Wahoo helps me earn my red badge of courage during a strap match," and it shows Wahoo McDaniel's about to punch Rick in the face. On July 4th, 1974, I won my first championship, the Mid-Atlantic Tag Team title, with Rip Hawk in Greensboro. We dethroned Paul Jones and Bob Bruggers, the former NFL player I trained with in Vern Gagne's camp. It would be 2 years before fans started calling me Nature Boy, but my on-air persona was definitely developing. While driving to WRAL Studios one day to cut promos, I heard Jerry Lee Lewis on the radio, and decided that I liked the way he screamed, "Woo!" in the middle of great balls of fire. Not long afterward, I gave it a try. "Everywhere I go, the people are shouting, 'Woo! There goes the big boss man!'" I declared, unaware that some 15 years later Ray Taylor would be using the name in the WWF. The "woo" started out short and clipped. It would later grow longer and louder. Because of my upbringing in the Minneapolis area, I found myself in a lot of six-man tag team matches alongside the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Gene and Ole Anderson. The Andersons weren't really brothers. Ole's name was actually Alan Rogowski, but they both came from Minnesota, and the promotion began billing me as their cousin. To me, Ole was a consummate wrestler. He was tough, he could talk, he looked great in the ring, and he really knew how to wrestle. Then Arn came along. He was like Ole, but better, because his interview skills were more creative. And his offensive wrestling was far superior. When the Andersons needed to make somebody look good, they did it better than anybody. There were stretches when they worked hour-long tag team matches every night, something you rarely see today, and kept fans captivated the entire time. They'd confine an opponent to their side of the ring, tagging in and out and working him over as he struggled to get back to his corner. The exhausted wrestler would move a few inches, getting the people excited over the possibility that he might tag his well-respected partner. Then the Andersons would pull him back, and the collective emotion of the audience would sink. They utilized crowd psychology in ways so many of today's wrestlers can't comprehend. It's not their fault. They never learned. That's why they get into the ring, do a few moves, high-five the guy in the corner, and step out, eliminating all the drama that would be associated with the tag. I was also getting an education on the red badge of courage, or bleeding. When you walked into the dressing room and looked at the rundown of matches, a little check next to your name signaled that it was your turn to get juice. Sometimes I'd cut myself anyways, just like Dusty would, if I believed it was going to add something to the confrontation. For example, if somebody hits you in the head with a chair, there should be blood. We didn't use chair shots as freely as today, so when you got smashed, it had impact. An older wrestler named Art Nielsen taught me the importance of bleeding. It adds so much more emotion to a match when the fans see me up close, taking a beating, with blood staining my platinum blonde hair. I've gone out of my way to whip my hair around so that the little droplets land on the fans. So that the little droplets of blood land on the fans. I picture some kid going home with blood on his clothes and showing it off to his friends. It's like catching a foul ball at a baseball game, only more exciting. These people pay for their tickets, and I want to give them something they'll remember. Despite all my bleeding, I don't look as carved up as Dusty or Carlos Colon, or so many other guys I've wrestled. I've used a lot of Neosporin and have just 2 white scars on my forehead. Everybody's skin heals differently. I guess I'm lucky. In the AWA, there were always hostile cities. The Chicago amphitheater had a rough crowd. The fans in Milwaukee were hard on bad guys, but at least there was security. In most of the arenas in the Carolinas, we didn't even have cops. And Southern fans were vastly different from the Danes and Swedes who'd attend Vern's Cards in Minneapolis. People would throw penknives or shoot pennies at us with slingshots. One night in Asheville, a guy ran up to the ring apron and a bag and threw a rattlesnake through the ropes. If we wrestled 7 nights a week, we had to be prepared for fanatical fans jumping into the ring during at least 4 of the shows. Some of the boys would encourage this kind of behavior, getting on the microphone to challenge spectators and hurting them if they accepted the offer. In Columbus, Georgia, one night, a 280-pound man sucker punched Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods and pulled off his masks. Woods got his mask back, took the fan down, and began toying with him on the mat. With the guy flat on his stomach, Woods crouched down behind him and pulled back his head with the crossface submission. The man opened his mouth and bit off one of Tim's fingers, putting an end to the open challenges in that town. In the WWF, Blackjack Mulligan was sliced in the leg down to the bone by a fan during a match against Pedro Morales and Boston Gardens. Jack wound up with a staph infection, which spreads through the body and can cause pneumonia or heart damage if it goes untreated. In the middle of the night, he knocked on Crazy Luke Graham's door, soaked in sweat. Luke looked down at Jack's leg, saw that it was flaming red, and rushed him to the hospitals. The doctor said that the attacker probably worked in a butcher shop because there was pig fat bacteria inside Mulligan's wound. They had to reopen his leg and scrape all that shit out. George Scott is the one who came up with the idea of naming me Nature Boy, just like the first Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, a former NWA title holder who became the WWF's inaugural champion. Rogers was a blonde wrestler with a silky walk and a cocky, sophisticated smile. Whenever you saw him in street clothes, every hair was in place, and he looked like $1,000,000. George was his friend and admirer, and thought that I could project the same sense of cool. I knew that Rogers used to strut in the ring, so I started doing the same thing. That doesn't mean that I did the same strut. No one could strut like Buddy Rogers, just like no one can swagger to the ring like Vince McMahon. I just developed a Ric Flair strut, sometimes breaking into it and breaking it in the middle of the action. Like Rogers, I used the figure 4 leg lock as my signature move. When people told me he used to smoke cigars, I went through my own cigar smoking phase and burned holes in all my clothes. I was definitely starting to stand out. On February 8, 1975, I won my first singles title, the Mid-Atlantic TV Championship, originally conceived as a title to be defended exclusively on television from Paul Jones. The notion seemed ridiculous at the time, but I was telling audiences that I was put on earth for only one reason, to be the world champion one day. Before a visit by NWA Kingpin Jack Briscoe to the Mid-Atlantic Territory, I did an interview about my alleged encounter with a fortune teller. "She looked at a line on my head," I began, "and she said, 'You're going to beat Paul Jones, you're going to beat Wahoo McDaniel, and you're going to beat Jack Briscoe. Woo! And you're going to be the world's champion.' She said, 'There's only one Nature Boy, and you are the greatest wrestler in the world today, Nature Boy. Know it for a fact.'" I never thought about my interviews until I arrived in the studio, but I could whip myself up and set fire to the crowd. I claimed to be bigger than Elvis, a huge insult to Southerners who had a special place in their hearts for the King, and that mere mention of my name could get people high. I also told a story about seeing myself on television and looking so good that even I got aroused. Here's another anecdote from David Crockett. When Ric was a bad guy, the women loved to hate him, but when the show was over, they loved to be with him. He had a bad habit of taking his clothes off. He'd often come out of the bathroom, walk up to a female sitting on the couch, and tap her on the head. Only he wasn't tapping her with her finger. Cowboy Lang was a midget wrestler. He'd walk around the dressing room in his cowboy hat and boots with his dick hanging practically below his knees. He was a good guy and loved to party after the shows, but he always expected me to get him laid. "You know, Cowboy," I'd explain, "it's hard to get a midget like you laid. Not all girls are attracted to midgets. But I had a friend in Charlotte, Sarge was her nickname because of her National Guard obligation. She always hosted the best parties, and if pressured, would always find a girl for Lang. As the night went on, I'd often find myself asking a lady, 'Hey, what do you think of my friend Cowboy Lang over there?' 'Oh no,' they'd usually say. 'I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to fuck a midget. I won't blow one. I won't do anything.' 'Okay,' I'd answer, 'but you don't know what you're missing.' At some point, I would manipulate things so that Cowboy Lang could take the girl to the side and show her his dick. Afterward, I'd see them walking out of the bar, hand in hand with his big cowboy hat coming up to just above her elbow. Thinking back, I honestly don't know how Leslie survived her marriage to me. I wasn't a real stable partner. We lived well, but I was so irresponsible. The territory was just wide open and you couldn't pay me to be home. Not because of anything Leslie ever did, but because I didn't want to miss a party. I was having too much fun being Ric Flair. And it wasn't even even a wrestler with the most honorable intentions would have a difficult time maintaining his family life. The holidays were huge wrestling days in the South. We wrestled twice on Thanksgiving, twice on Christmas, and twice on Easter. You went to work if you were hurt. You went to work if your wife was sick. You went to work if your kid had to go to the emergency room. You went to work or you didn't get paid. Or even worse, you lost your spot. Given my concerns about building my name both in the ring and in the bars, I never would have considered taking a night off. What no one knew was that there was a long layoff ahead. A sabbatical that nearly flamed out the career of Nature Boy Ric Flair years before its peak. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, which I'm going to go into tomorrow, is entitled The Man Who Saved Wrestling. Thank you all for listening to my videos, and if you like it, then like, subscribe, and suck my dick.